The morning the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction was announced, Harlan Moss was standing at the head of the Meridian Literary Review's all-staff meeting with a printed agenda in his hand and 40 people watching him. The agenda listed 3 line items: budget approvals, a new submission calendar, a brief note on housekeeping matters regarding the shared printer. He had written that last item himself, 4 months earlier, after finding pages left behind by someone who apparently believed the copy room was a creative writing workshop. He had crumpled those pages in front of 6 colleagues. He had dropped them in the trash and smiled. He had said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, that a literary magazine of Meridian standing had no room for amateur hour at the printer. The people who witnessed it had laughed or looked away, or both. What you need to understand about Harlan Moss is that he had built a career on knowing what did and did not belong. He had run Meridian's review division for 19 years. He had turned down 2 writers who went on to win major prizes. He had accepted 3 who did not. He considered his record, on balance, respectable. He had taste, real taste, cultivated taste, and he applied it with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that the taste he was applying might have a blind spot the size of a room. What did Harlan Moss say when Warren Lent, chairman of the Meridian Publishing Group, walked into that meeting unannounced and read the Pulitzer winner's name aloud? Before we get to that, we need to understand who Celestine Ware was the day she first walked into Meridian Literary Review 22 years before that morning. Because you cannot understand the silence that followed Warren's words without understanding what it cost to fill it. Let me take you back. Celestine Ware came to Meridian at the age of 22 with a cardboard box of belongings and a letter of hire for the position of copy filing assistant. The office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan, and when she stepped off the elevator for the first time, the carpet was the colour of old moss, and the shelves that lined every hallway were stacked with manuscripts in cream-coloured folders, and the air smelled the way she imagined serious things smelled, like paper and possibility, and someone else's ambition. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have before finding the office manager's desk. She was aware that she was the only black woman on that floor. She filed that fact the way she filed everything, carefully and without comment. She'd grown up in Baltimore, in a 2-bedroom house on Lanvale Street, raised by her grandmother Ida Ware after her mother moved south to follow work that never stayed put in one place. Ida was 63 years old the year Celestine came to live with her, and 63 was not old in Ida's body, which moved like something that had made peace with hard floors and early mornings and carrying more than its share. Ida worked as a seamstress for a dry cleaning shop 4 days a week and did alterations from the kitchen table the other 3. She was up before 6 every morning to iron what needed ironing before the light changed, and she had a radio on the counter she kept tuned to a gospel station, not loud, barely above the sound of the household, the way she kept most things, present and understated. She cooked rice at night with the lid slightly ajar so the steam could find its way out. She had strong opinions about thread tension and the proper weight of a hem, and she had no opinions whatsoever about the things other people thought were important, like what the neighbours drove or where a child went to school when any library card would do. The library. That was the thing Ida felt about with the seriousness some people reserve for religion, and she would have considered the comparison fair. She walked Celestine to the Enoch Pratt branch on Cathedral Street every Saturday from the time Celestine was 6, and she sat in the wooden chair by the window and did small hand-sewing repairs from her bag, while Celestine moved through the stacks with the focused unreasonableness of a child who believes she can read the whole building given enough Saturdays. Ida never told her what to choose. She trusted the choosing to the child, and the child trusted the choosing to whatever drew her hand toward a spine, and between the 2 of them they managed a kind of education that no one had officially arranged. She had a sewing kit that was not a kit so much as a history, a tin that had once held shortbread cookies and now held thread in 31 colours, 3 needles of different gauges, a thimble worn so thin it had developed a small hole, and a folded piece of paper on which Ida had written in her large looping hand a single sentence. Celestine was 9 years old when she found the paper and read it. She read it standing at the kitchen table while her grandmother's hands moved through a hem and the light from the window came in at an angle that turned the thread gold. The paper said, "A crumpled page is not a dead page. It just needs someone with enough sense to smooth it out." She asked Ida what it meant. Ida looked up from the fabric and looked at her granddaughter with the expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this question. "What it means," Ida said, "is that nothing that came from a thinking mind is finished just because somebody wadded it up and threw it away. Not a plan, Not a letter, not a life. You find the page, you smooth it flat with your palm, and you read what it says. That is all. Celestine was 9. She nodded the way 9-year-olds nod when they hear something too large for the moment to fully hold, and she folded the paper back and put it in the tin and went to do her homework. But the sentence went into her the way certain things go in when you are that age, not through memory, but through the body, so that years later she would find it surfacing at the exact moment she needed it without ever having consciously summoned it. Ida died when Celestine was 34, a Tuesday in February, quietly in the hospital bed that the hospice workers had set up in the living room of the Landvale Street house because Ida had said she was not leaving that house until she was ready, and she was the kind of woman whose statements on such matters were treated as fact. Celestine had taken the train down from New York and had sat beside her grandmother for 4 days. On the last morning, before Ida's breathing changed, Celestine had held her hand, and Ida had said, without opening her eyes, "You are going to have to stop waiting for the right room to be handed to you. You walk in, you sit down. That's it." She died with the morning light on her face. Celestine brought the sewing tin back to New York. She kept it on her desk at Meridian, between the stapler and the outbox tray, where the other assistants kept personal photographs. From the tin, she took the braided thread, cream and brown, and a thin stripe of green, which Ida had made from scraps of 3 different jobs, and she looped it and knotted it and wore it as the cord for her reading glasses. Every morning when she put the glasses on, the cord settled against the back of her neck and she felt it there all day, the way you feel a thing that has been given to you by someone who knew exactly what they were giving. For 22 years, Celestine Ware filed manuscripts. That is the plain fact of it, and it contains an entire life. 11,468 manuscripts came through the Meridian Literary Review's submission process in those 22 years. Celestine logged every one of them into the system, organised them by genre and submission date, assigned them their numbers, cross-referenced them with the reader reports that came back from the editorial team, and filed them in the long grey drawers that occupied the back room of the 14th floor. She knew the system better than anyone alive. She could locate a submission by memory if you gave her a year and a rough description of the subject matter. She had once found a manuscript that 3 editors had declared lost, opening a drawer, moving 3 folders, and placing the document on the desk of the editor who needed it in under 90 seconds. Nobody awarded a Pulitzer for that. What they asked her to do at staff meetings was take notes. What they asked her to do at lunch was order the sandwiches. When a new editor joined the team, they were introduced to Celestine in the hallway and told she was the person to ask if they needed something filed. They shook her hand and turned away, and she watched them walk toward the conference room where her boss had reserved them a seat at the table, and she returned to her desk and logged the next submission. There were editors who had been at Meridian for 3 years who did not know her full name. There was one, a young man named Preston, who had come from an MFA program in Iowa and wore reading glasses he did not actually need, who called her the files lady in a conversation she was close enough to hear. She had been there 14 years at that point. She filed his first accepted submission with the same care she gave every other one, cross-referenced and time-stamped and placed in the correct drawer, and she thought nothing about him that she allowed herself to keep. She read everything. That is important to understand. She did not read manuscripts because her job required it. Her job required that she log them. She read them because she could not read them, the way some people cannot pass a ball of string without pulling the loose end, cannot hear music without their foot starting to move. She read in the copy room during her lunch break. She read on the subway with her knees pressed together and the folder flat on her lap and the braided cord warm at her neck. She had thoughts about what she read, detailed thoughts, and nowhere to put them, so she put them in the notebooks she kept in the drawer of her kitchen table at home. 3 composition notebooks over 22 years, each one filled in her small, careful handwriting with observations about language and structure and what a piece of prose did and did not do in the places where it most needed to do something. She was not building a portfolio. She was thinking. She had not yet understood that the two were the same thing. The story began at 4:30 in the morning, 3 years before the Pulitzer announcement, when she could not sleep. She had been lying in the dark, listening to the radiator knock and thinking about a novel she had read 6 months earlier, a novel that had been submitted to Meridian and rejected at the first reader stage, a novel she had picked up from the discard pile because she could not let something discarded sit unread, and the novel was about a black family in Louisiana navigating a floodplain, and the prose was not finished, but the bones of it were extraordinary. And nobody at Meridian had looked past the surface imperfections to find what was underneath. And lying there in the dark, she thought, what if there is a story that only I know how to tell, because I have spent 22 years reading 10,000 other people's attempts, and I have understood, at a level below conscious thought, what makes the thing live or not live, and I have never tried. She got up. She made coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning, and she opened a new composition notebook and she wrote the first sentence of a novel. She wrote badly at first. That is also important to understand. The first 40 pages came out overworked and self-conscious, the way writing comes out when a person knows too much about how it is supposed to sound. She put them aside. She started again. The second beginning was shorter and plainer and more honest, and from that plainness, something grew. She learned in those pre-dawn hours that her instincts as a reader were more reliable than her instincts as a writer, and the only way to close that gap was to write until the gap disappeared. And the gap disappeared slowly. Sentence by sentence, morning by morning, while the city outside her window was still dark and the coffee went cold in the cup and the sewing tin sat on the counter, catching the light above the stove. She missed 3 mornings the whole time she was writing it. Once for a fever, once for her cousin's wedding in Philadelphia, once because she sat down at the table and opened the notebook and looked at the last sentence she had written and understood, sitting there in her robe, that the chapter needed to be started over from a different point in time, and she spent those 2 hours working through the problem in her head without writing a single word. And the next morning she wrote from the new entry point, and what came out was the best 30 pages of the book. The novel was about a woman named Osie, the daughter of a sharecropper in Alabama in 1942, who taught herself to read law from newspapers found at the bottom of cotton sacks, folded and torn, and sometimes illegible, and who built from those fragments an argument that eventually freed her brother from a charge that had been fabricated by a county official who had never imagined a black woman from a dirt farm could read well enough to refute him. The novel was called The Salt Ground. Celestine wrote it in the hours before her shift. 4:30 to 7:15, 5 mornings a week for 2 years and 3 months. She did not tell anyone. The novel grew the way something grows that has found its own water source, without needing to be tended, just needing to be given the time. By the end of the second year, it was 340 pages, and she had revised it twice, the second time going sentence by sentence over the course of 11 weeks. And when she read the final version, she felt the specific stillness that comes when a thing has become what it was trying to be. She did not send it to Meridian. She was not naive. She submitted the manuscript under her initials, CW, to 3 other publishers in the city. One of them a fiction imprint owned by the same parent company as Meridian, but housed in a different building and staffed by entirely different people. She did not want anyone at the review to know. She wanted the work to be evaluated clean. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday. She read it at her desk at Meridian, between logging 2 new submissions, with the braided cord of her glasses warm at the back of her neck, and the Meridian logo on the wall 10 feet away. She read it twice. She put it in her bag. She logged the next submission. Now let me paint the full picture of the morning that matters. It was a Thursday in January, 4 months before the Pulitzer announcement, and Celestine had come in early for reasons that had nothing to do with the novel. A chapter she had been revising for a small reading she'd agreed to give at a community library had needed printing, and she had printed it at 6:45 a.m. before anyone else arrived, and she had intended to collect the pages from the shared printer immediately, and had been stopped by a phone call from the copy system vendor about a filing software update that ran 23 minutes long, and by the time she got off the phone, Harlan Moss had arrived. He had found the pages in the printer tray. She came around the corner of the hallway and she saw him standing at the printer with 47 pages in his hand, his reading glasses on his nose, and she saw his face while he read, the particular quality of his attention, not the attention of someone who is moved or uncertain, but the attention of someone who has already decided. He looked up. 6 of her colleagues were within visible range of that hallway, doors open, coffee cups in hand, the ordinary beginning of an ordinary Thursday. He said, "Whose pages are these?" She said, "Mine." He said, "You write fiction?" He said it the way someone might say, "You pilot commercial aircraft?" Not with cruelty, with simple disbelief, and the simple disbelief was its own specific cruelty. She said, "Yes." He looked at her for one beat. Then he crumpled the pages. not in anger, methodically, section by section, pressing the paper into a dense mass with the flat of his palm, and he dropped the mass into the recycling bin beside the printer, and he looked at her again, and he said with the mild and certain authority of a man who had run this magazine for 19 years, that the copy room was not a writing workshop, that the printer was for business use, that perhaps she could explore other outlets for creative pursuits. He walked away. 6 people had witnessed it. None of them spoke. One of them, a senior copy editor named Paula, who had worked alongside Celestine for 11 years, turned back to her desk without making eye contact. Marcus Teal, 19 years old, 3 months into his internship, stood in the doorway with a folder in his hand and his mouth slightly open, and he felt, he would later say, the specific nausea of someone who has watched a wrong thing happen and done nothing, and he carried it home with him that night and could not eat dinner and could not explain to himself or anyone else why he had not said something, and did not yet understand that the time to speak had been before the pages hit the bin, not after, and that understanding would take him months. Celestine did not move for a moment. In her chest there was something she identified only as pressure, not pain exactly, closer to the physical sensation of a word you know that will not surface, everything pushing forward and nothing coming out. She was aware of the hallway, She was aware of the morning light through the window at the end of the corridor, the particular quality of winter light in January that is bright and gives no warmth. She put her thumb and forefinger on the braided cord of her glasses and held it. She pressed until she could feel each individual braid. She counted them the way she had learned to count things that required steadiness. Then she walked to her desk. She sat down. She opened the filing system and logged the next submission. She did not retrieve the pages. She had other copies. What she did not know as she sat at her desk with the cord pressed between her fingers was that someone else had witnessed something she had not seen. Sylvia Okafor, senior acquisitions editor, whose office was at the far end of the 14th floor and whose door had been open, had come down the hall 20 minutes after Celestine left the printer area and had stopped at the recycling bin and had looked in and had recognized the paper as a manuscript draft from the weight and spacing of it. A printed manuscript has a particular quality, even crumpled. The margins uniform, the font consistent, different from a report or a memo, and Sylvia had been reading manuscripts long enough to know it in an instant. She had taken it out. She had uncrumpled it, section by section, pressing each crumpled mass flat with her palm on the surface of the copy room counter. She had taken the 47 pages to her office. She had read them through before lunch. Sylvia had been at Meridian for 31 years. She had started as a reader and moved into acquisitions through the kind of patient lateral movement that is the only path open to certain people in certain organizations, where the direct vertical route is occupied by others who mistake persistence for merit and length of tenure for authority. She had read enough fiction to know the difference between competence and gift, and what she held in those crumpled pages, crease marks cutting through paragraphs, one section torn at the corner where Harlan's grip had caught it, was not competence. The voice was spare and honest, and the scene she was reading, a woman in 1942 flattening a torn newspaper in her lap in a cotton field at dusk, had a quality she recognized and could not fully name, which was always the sign of the real thing. She had thought of Celestine every day since. She had said nothing. She had watched and waited in the way that people who understand institutions wait, who know that the wrong move at the wrong moment does not open a door, it closes one, building toward the moment when their intervention can hold. The Pulitzer announcement came on an April morning. At 9:07 a.m., a press release went out. At 9:12, the executive assistant to Warren Lent sent a calendar hold to every senior Meridian staff member for a 9:45 meeting in the main conference room, flagged urgent. Nobody knew why. Staff speculation ran toward the budget. Harlan Moss arrived at 9:42 with his printed agenda from the earlier all-hands, a different meeting that had been bumped to make room for this one. Warren Lent walked in at 9:44. He was 66 years old and had the bearing of someone who had delivered important news many times and understood that the way a thing is said determines whether people believe it. He stood at the head of the room. He waited until the room was quiet. He said, "Meridian Publishing Group has a Pulitzer Prize winner." He said, "The novel The Salt Ground, published this past fall by our Broadfield fiction imprint, has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. The author writes under the name C.W.W. Ware." He said, "Her full name is Celestine Ware. She has worked in this building on the 14th floor as our copy filing manager for 22 years. The room took a breath and held it. Harlan Moss did not move. Later, Marcus Teal would describe what he saw from across the conference table with the precision of someone who had been replaying it for days before he could find the words. He said, Harlan's face did not go red or white. He said it went very still, the stillness of a person trying to locate themselves inside a piece of information that will not organize into anything manageable. His hands were flat on the table. His printed agenda was in front of him with its 3-line items, including the note about the shared printer, and his eyes dropped to it once and then did not move again. Marcus said it was as if the room had tilted, and Harlan was the only person who felt it. Around him, the rest of the room was doing the thing rooms do when a fact enters that requires the reorganization of everything known before it. People looked at each other. People looked at the door. A woman at the far end of the table, the deputy circulation editor, pressed her fingers to her mouth. Sylvia Okafor sat very still in her chair and looked at Warren Lent with the expression of someone who has been holding a breath for 4 months. Celestine was not in the room. She had not been invited to this meeting because this meeting had been organised for senior staff, and she was not senior staff. She was at her desk on the 14th floor, logging the morning's submissions, her reading glasses on her nose and the braided cord warm at her neck when her desk phone rang. The caller identified himself as Warren Lent's assistant. He said Mr. Lent would like Ms. Ware to come to the main conference room. He said, "Please, take your time." She took off her glasses. She set them on the desk. She looked at the sewing tin beside the stapler for a moment. She thought of Ida's voice in the dark hospital room on Lanvale Street. "You walk in. You sit down." Then she put the glasses back on, straightened the cord at her neck, stood up, and walked down the hall. When she came through the door, 40 people turned to look at her in their different ways, and Warren Lent crossed the room to meet her at the door, which nobody had expected, and he extended his hand. And he said, loud enough for all of it to be heard, that it was an honour to have her work in the Meridian family of publications, and that he was sorry it had taken this morning for everyone in this room to understand what they had had on this floor for 22 years. He said that directly, in front of everyone. Celestine shook his hand. She said, "Thank you." She said it once without decoration, and she stood in the room and let it hold her, and anyone watching closely enough would have seen her fingers find the braided cord and press, gently, once, and release. What did Harlan Moss say? He said nothing. That was what he said. He sat in his chair with his printed agenda in front of him, both hands flat on the table, and he did not speak, and eventually other people spoke, and the meeting continued around him the way a current continues around something fixed and immovable in the water, and his silence was the loudest thing in the room. The institutional consequence was delivered the following week without theatre. Meridian's parent company conducted what was described in the press release as a review of editorial leadership, prompted by what Warren Lent called in a private memo to the board a culture of gatekeeping inconsistent with the organisation's stated values. Harlan Moss was offered an early retirement package. He took it. His nameplate was removed from the door of the editor-in-chief's office on a Friday morning while Celestine was at her desk logging submissions, and Sylvia Okafor was in a meeting with Warren Lent about the terms of her appointment as the new editor-in-chief of Meridian Literary Review. Marcus Teal had submitted a written account of the printer incident to HR 2 days after the announcement, unsolicited. He was 20 years old, had been at Meridian for 4 months, and he said in the account that he had been standing in the hallway and had seen what happened and had felt ashamed of his own silence every day since. The account went into the file that Warren Lent reviewed. Marcus was called in and thanked. He remained at Meridian. When Sylvia became editor-in-chief, she made him a reader. Sylvia's first act in the new office was to call Celestine in. She offered her the position of Senior Fiction Acquisitions Editor. She said the salary was significant and the title was accurate. She said she had been reading Celestine's work since January, since the Crumpled pages, and she said she had read every word of The Salt Ground in its published form in December, with the specific pleasure of a person who recognised something that had been there all along. She said one more thing. She said, "I should have spoken sooner. I want you to know I understand what that silence cost, and I am sorry for it." Celestine looked at her for a moment. She said, "You smoothed the pages out. That is what mattered." Sylvia held that for a beat, and then her eyes went bright, and she pressed her lips together, and she looked away toward the shelves of cream-coloured folders. And when she looked back, her face was composed, and her voice was level, and she said, "Yes, I did. Now let's get to work." Celestine sat across from her in the chair that faced the editor-in-chief's desk. She looked at the shelves that lined the walls, the manuscripts in every direction, and she thought of herself at 22, stepping off the elevator and smelling paper and possibility. She thought of Ida's hands moving through a hem. She thought of the sentence on the folded paper in the cookie tin. She said, yes. She took the rest of the morning to think about it, which was no time at all. The novel launched in May with a publication party that Meridian's parent company hosted at a venue in Lower Manhattan, and the room was full of people who had heard of CW. Where before that morning in April, and people who had not, and Celestine stood at the front of the room in a black dress she had bought the week before, the braided cord at her neck, and she read from the first chapter of The Salt Ground, the passage where O.C. finds a torn newspaper at the bottom of a cotton sack and sits in the field at dusk reading a fragment of a legal brief she cannot fully understand but recognises, at the level of the body, as containing a kind of power. She read it the way she had written it, without hurry, letting the sentences land where they needed to land. The room was very quiet while she read. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for something to be over, but the other kind of quiet, the kind that forms when people have stopped thinking about anything except what is in front of them. When she looked up at the end of the passage, what she saw was people looking back at her with recognition, not surprise. The novel had been in the world since the fall. They had read it, many of them. They already knew O.C., already knew the cotton fields and the torn newspapers and the county courthouse and the slow grinding work of building something true from discarded fragments. They were looking at the woman who had built it. Afterward, a woman came up to her, someone Celestine did not know, middle-aged, wearing a lanyard from a university she didn't recognise, and the woman said simply, "My grandmother." That was all. Celestine nodded. She understood. The woman pressed her hand and left. She was invited that fall to deliver the keynote at a symposium on literary access at Columbia University. She stood at the podium in a room where every wall was lined with books, the braided cord at her neck, and she said that the question she was asked most often since the Pulitzer was whether she had been afraid to submit the manuscript, afraid of rejection, afraid of failure, and she said the honest answer was that she had not been afraid of rejection. She had been afraid for years of a different thing. She had been afraid that she would never try, that she would finish her life having watched other people take up the space that language could have given her. She said, "Language is the one thing nobody can repossess. Not the landlord, not the boss, not anybody. It is yours." She paused for a moment after she said it, the way someone pauses after they have given back what was given to them. Then she said one more thing. She said that in the year the novel was published, a survey of 5 major American literary magazines found that fewer than 8% of their editorial mastheads were held by black women. She said, "The Salt Ground was accepted by the same publishing group that employs the magazine where I was a copy filer. The imprint that took the book did not know who I was. They evaluated the work. That is the only condition under which it was possible for this book to exist, not the condition I would have asked for, the one that was available. A room that had been quiet went quieter. There is something specific that happens when a person has done the work alone, before dawn, without witness, without recognition, for years, and then stands in a room where the recognition finally arrives. It is not triumph. Triumph is a loud thing, a performance for the people who doubted you. This is quieter. This is the feeling of finally being in the same room as the version of yourself you have been moving toward, and finding that she has been waiting, patient and undiminished, through all of it. What you do with that belongs only to you. The question this story leaves is not whether Celestine Ware deserved what she received. That is not a real question. The question is the one she asked herself at 4:30 in the morning, standing at the kitchen table in her robe before the coffee finished, notebook open, first sentence not yet written. Not whether she was good enough. She already knew the answer to that. The question was whether she would begin. You know someone in a room like Celestine's, carrying what they carry, showing what they show, keeping the rest in a drawer. If you have never told that person what you see in them, this is the moment. Because they are asking themselves the question right now, and the answer they settle on may depend on something as small as a voice saying, "I read your pages, I smoothed them flat, and I did not look away." If this story found you, pass it to someone who needed it more. 3 months after the Columbia keynote, Celestine cleared out her old desk on the 14th floor and moved her things to the acquisitions editor's office 2 doors down from Sylvia's. The movers carried the grey filing drawers to a new room. Her new assistant would manage them now. On the last day, Celestine stood at her old desk and opened the top drawer, the one she had never let anyone else touch in 22 years, and she took out the sewing tin. She opened it. Inside, beside the thread and the needles and the worn thimble, was a single piece of paper, creased and straightened so many times that it had gone soft along the fold lines, the way paper goes when it has been handled with care for decades. She unfolded it. She read the sentence in Ida's looping hand one more time. She folded it back. She put the tin in her bag. She walked down the hall, past the shelves of cream-coloured folders, past the elevator where she had stood at 22 and smelled paper and possibility, to her new office where she sat down at her desk and put the tin between the stapler and the outbox tray, right where it belonged.